They found the ledger first, not the letter, though it was the letter tucked inside its back cover that would matter more in the end. And if you have ever opened a drawer in a house not your own and felt the sudden uneasy sense that you were not meant to find what lay inside, you will understand exactly what passed through Alice Brennan's hands on the November morning she was told to sort her uncle's old estate papers for burning. The ledger was water-stained along one corner and smelled faintly of the cedar chest it had spent a decade inside, and its final page in a hand she recognized before she had even finished reading the signature recorded a dismissal, swift and without appeal, of a man accused of a theft he had not committed. If you enjoy stories where the quiet ones turn out to be the ones worth watching, stay with us, because this is one of those, and we would be glad if you subscribed and told us when it is finished whether you guessed the truth before the Duke did. Now back to the ledger, and to the woman who had not yet decided what to do with it. She was 24 that autumn, and she had spent the better part of 6 years as a poor relation in her aunt's house at Belcourt, useful in the way that unmarried nieces without fortune are useful, which is to say, constantly and invisibly expected to arrange flowers and mind children, and defer to the opinions of women with less sense than herself, but considerably more money. She had grown skilled over those years at a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a woman who has learned that a strong reaction, however justified, will always be used against her later, and so she had trained herself instead to receive insult and disappointment with the same even composure, filing each one away privately rather than spending it on display. She did not think of this as weakness. She thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as thrift, the same instinct that made her mend her own gloves rather than buy new ones, applied instead to her own dignity. That composure was tested more than usual the week her cousin Louisa arranged the dinner at Marchmont Hall, because Louisa had a gift, cultivated over years of practice, for constructing small cruelties that looked, from the outside, like generosity. "You are seated beside the Duke," Louisa told her, over breakfast, with the particular brightness she used when she wanted an insult, mistaken for a favour, beside Marchmont himself. "I do hope you can manage 2 hours of silence, Alice, because I am told he has not offered a full sentence to anyone at dinner in 3 years. A pause. The Duke of Marchmont was, by every account circulating in that part of the county, the coldest man to hold a title within 100 miles, a widower of 31 who had inherited both his father's estate and his father's talent for making a room feel smaller and colder simply by entering it, and who was known to sit through entire dinners offering nothing beyond the correct minimum of courtesy required by his rank, a courtesy so exact and so empty that hostesses had begun quietly competing to see who could provoke from him even a single unguarded word. Louisa's plan, transparent to anyone who cared to examine it, was simple: seat her plain, penniless cousin beside the one man in England least likely to offer her any warmth, and let the evening's silence do the humiliating on her behalf, while Louisa herself sat further down the table beside more promising company, gathering admiration she had done nothing to earn. But this is where we must go back, because you cannot understand what Alice carried to that dinner, folded quietly beneath her composure the way a letter is folded beneath a ribbon, unless you understand what the name Marchmont had already cost her family once before. 14 years earlier, Thomas Brennan had been the finest garden architect in 3 counties, a man who had trained under the great designers of the previous generation and who had been engaged at considerable expense and greater trust to redesign the grounds of Marchmont Hall for the old Duke. A project that had occupied nearly 4 years of his life and had produced by the end of it a walled garden and a glasshouse orangery. considered by every visitor who saw them finished among the finest private grounds in England. He had not merely designed them, he had built them with his own hands where he could, had trained the estate's under-gardeners himself, had kept meticulous ledgers of every seed, every specimen, every rare orchid imported at extraordinary cost from collectors abroad, because he believed, as a matter of professional pride, that a man's work should be accountable down to the last shilling. It was this very thoroughness that made the accusation, when it came, so difficult for him to survive. In the final months of the project, 3 of the rarest orchid specimens, imported at a cost that alone exceeded a groundsman's yearly wage, went missing from the orangery's locked collection room, and the estate's steward at the time, ambitious man named Josiah Red, who had resented Thomas Brennan's authority over the grounds from the first week of the commission, moved quickly to suggest in quiet conversations with the old Duke that the gardener himself had taken them. There was no proof beyond suspicion, and Red's own carefully seeded doubt, and Thomas Brennan, given no formal hearing and no opportunity to defend himself before men who might have judged the evidence fairly, was dismissed within the week, his name quietly ruined among the collectors and patrons who had once sought his services, his final payment withheld pending an investigation that was never properly conducted and never concluded. He returned home to his young daughter with nothing but his tools, his notebooks, and a grief so total that Alice, only 10 years old at the time, remembered it now less as sadness than as a kind of permanent weather that settled over their household and never entirely lifted. He died 6 years later, having never worked again in his profession, having spent his final years cultivating a small kitchen garden behind their cottage with the same exacting care he had once given to a duke's grounds, as though the scale of the work no longer mattered so long as the work itself was done properly. He told Alice once, in the last spring of his life, kneeling beside her in the dirt while they set out seedlings, "The earth does not care who kneels in it, only that someone finally does." She had not understood it then. She had spent the years since coming to understand it rather better than she wished to. He left her his notebooks, dense with diagrams and planting schedules and years of careful observation, a record so thorough it amounted to a complete education in the design and maintenance of exactly the sort of garden he had built and lost, had absorbed all of it the way a child absorbs a language spoken constantly around her, until she found in her aunt's modest grounds at Belcourt that her own hands seemed to know things about pruning and soil and the patient correction of neglect. She kept this knowledge quiet, mostly because a woman's expertise in anything beyond needlework or music was considered, in her aunt's circle, faintly embarrassing, but she practiced it anyway in stolen hours, restoring corners of the Belcourt garden that the hired man had let go to ruin, not accounts of money, but of small justices and small unfairnesses, a habit of accounting she had inherited as surely as she had inherited her father's steady hands. So when Louisa told her brightly that she would be seated beside the Duke of Marchmont at dinner, Alice did not answer with the distress her cousin had clearly hoped for. She said only, "Very well," and returned to her mending, and if Louisa noticed anything unusual in her composure, she mistook it, as she mistook most things about her cousin, for dullness rather than the particular stillness of a woman who has just been handed, without anyone intending it as a gift, the first opportunity in 14 years to sit across a table from the family that had ruined her father. She did not plan that week exactly what she would say. She only found herself returning, in idle moments, to her father's notebooks, rereading his careful diagrams of the Marchmont orangery as though preparing for an examination she could not yet name, and by the 4th morning before the dinner she understood, with the same quiet clarity her father must have felt kneeling in his kitchen garden, that she was not dreading this evening at all. She was, in some manner, she did not entirely wish to examine. Curious what 14 years had done to the son of the man who had ruined his. Marchmont Hall, when she arrived on the evening of the dinner, struck her first, not as grand, but as cold, in the particular way great houses become cold when the people inside them have stopped noticing the difference between order and emptiness. The halls were correctly lit, correctly warmed, and yet the whole of it carried an air of a house maintained, rather than lived in, every room arranged for appearances no one present seemed to genuinely enjoy. She thought, walking through it, of her father's descriptions of the grounds he had built here, and she wondered whether they had fared any better than the house itself. The Duke of Marchmont, Nathaniel Gray, entered the drawing-room precisely on time, as he entered everything. A tall, composed man whose face had settled, over years of practised restraint, into an expression so carefully unreadable that guests often left his company uncertain. He had inherited the title 6 years earlier, along with a grief he had never publicly examined, the death of a young wife within the first year of their marriage, a loss the county still spoke of in hushed, respectful tones he had long since grown to despise, because sympathy, offered constantly and never invited, had taught him to prefer silence to conversation and formality to warmth. The one armour he had found reliable enough to wear every day without fail. He had attended 100 dinners exactly like this one, seated beside 100 women he did not remember afterward, and he expected, taking his place at the table that evening, that this one would proceed the same way it always did. Correct conversation offered and received without any particular weight, followed by an early and welcome retreat to his study once propriety allowed it. This is, naturally, the precise sort of expectation a story such as this one exists to dismantle. He turned to greet the woman seated beside him with the same measured nod he offered everyone, and found himself instead pausing very slightly at something in her expression that he could not immediately place, a composure that did not read as the anxious deference he usually met at his own table, but something closer to patient, unhurried observation, as though she were assessing him rather than the reverse. "Miss Brennan," he said, reading her place card, "Your Grace, I understand you are Mrs. Ashford's niece." "I am." A silence. He had expected, as he always expected, that this silence would stretch into the comfortable, forgettable emptiness that filled most of his dinners, and he was mildly, privately, unsettled to find that it did not stretch at all, that it sat instead between them, as though she had chosen not to fill it, rather than failed to think of anything to say. Most people rushed to fill his silences, out of nervousness or ambition, and their rushing had long ago become to him a kind of noise he had learned to tune out entirely. Hers was different. Hers felt like patience. "You are not," he said finally, testing the observation aloud before he had fully decided to voice it, "attempting to entertain me?" "No," Alice said. "I understood I was seated here to be endured, not entertained, Your Grace. I thought it kinder to both of us not to pretend otherwise." He looked at her properly then, for the first time, and something in his carefully arranged face shifted, not quite a smile, not yet, but the first faint crack in an expression that had not moved unrehearsed in longer than he could easily remember. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me at this table in several years. I find honesty requires very little effort, Your Grace, once a person stops being afraid of what it might cost." He did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed felt, to both of them, entirely different from the one that had come before. The dinner proceeded from that point, in a manner that unsettled every observer at the table, precisely because nothing about it looked unusual from the outside, correct courses served correctly, correct conversation exchanged at correct volume. Watching from 3 seats down with her fan half raised, and her attention increasingly divided from the gentleman she had positioned herself beside, began to notice, with a rising and entirely unwelcome unease, that the Duke of Marchmont was actually speaking, in complete, unguarded sentences. To the cousin she had seated there, specifically to be ignored. Alice, for her part, kept her side of the conversation exactly as plain as she had promised, offering the Duke neither flattery nor performance, answering his questions about her opinions on the season's poor harvest and the county's road repairs with the same unhurried factual precision. This refusal to perform warmth she did not feel, or interest she had not earned, that the Duke found himself, against every habit of 11 years, increasingly unable to look away from. "You do not ask me anything about myself," he observed, midway through the second course, in a tone that suggested he had noticed this only just now, and found the noticing itself somewhat disorienting. "I assumed you preferred not to be asked," Alice said. "Most men of your position do, in my experience, though they rarely say so directly." "And how," he asked, "did you come by that experience?" "By watching a great many men of your position avoid answering questions they had not chosen to be asked." A pause. "You are unusually direct, Miss Brennan." "I am unusually poor, Your Grace, which affords a woman very little use for indirection. I have found that plain speech saves a great deal of time, even if it occasionally costs a little comfort." He set down his glass, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, and Louisa, watching from her seat, saw something cross the Duke's face that she had genuinely never seen there before in the 3 years she had studied him for exactly this purpose, an expression she could not immediately name but recognized, with a sinking unease she did not yet fully understand, as the beginning of something her dare had entirely failed to account for. By the time the final course was cleared, the Duke of Marchmont had spoken more words to Alice Brennan across 2 hours than he had spoken to any dinner companion in the 6 years since his wife's death, and when the women rose to withdraw, he did something that startled the entire table into a silence far more genuine than any that had preceded it that evening. He rose as well, before propriety strictly required it, and asked plainly whether Miss Brennan might be permitted to remain a few moments longer, as he wished to ask her opinion. His grounds— Alice felt the words settle into her like a key finding, unexpectedly, the lock it had been cut for. "I understand," he said, once the room had emptied enough to permit something resembling privacy, "that you have some knowledge of gardens." "A little," Alice said carefully, though her pulse had quickened in a way her voice did not betray. "My steward tells me the old walled garden and the orangery have been neglected for years since before my time, and I confess I have never known what to do with either beyond letting them continue as they are. I do not know why I ask you this. You will think it a strange question to put to a woman I have known for 2 hours." "I do not think it strange, Your Grace," Alice said. "I think it the first sensible question anyone in this house has asked about that garden in 14 years. He did not understand that evening the full weight of what she had just told him, but he understood enough to feel for the first time in longer than he could comfortably measure, genuinely curious about a person rather than merely correct toward one. And it was in that small, unremarkable moment, over a cooling cup of tea neither of them finished, that the coldest Duke in England began, without quite realizing it, to thaw. The weeks following that dinner unfolded with a strange doubled quality that Alice found herself turning over privately each night before sleep, ordinary on the surface, since she returned each day to the same mending and the same small deferences at Belcourt, and yet entirely altered beneath it, because she now carried, folded quietly, done an invitation she had not expected and could not quite believe she had accepted. The Duke of Marchmont had asked, through a formal note delivered by his steward the following week, whether Miss Brennan might consent to advise on the restoration of the Marchmont grounds in whatever capacity she felt appropriate to her situation, at whatever hours suited her convenience, for whatever modest compensation her aunt's household would permit her to accept without impropriety. Her aunt, scenting opportunity rather than understanding its true shape, agreed at once, and Louisa, hearing the arrangement described at breakfast, went very quiet in a manner that suggested she was already beginning to regret the dare she had issued with such confidence 3 weeks before. Alice arrived at Marchmont's walled garden on the first Tuesday of December and stood for a long moment at its gate before entering, because what lay beyond it was not merely neglect, the ordinary neglect of a garden left too long without proper attention, but something closer to abandonment entirely, beds gone to bramble and weed, glass in the orangery cracked and furred with frost, paths buried beneath years of unswept leaf mould, the whole of it standing in exactly the kind of cold, decayed stillness her father used to say frightened careless men and invited patient ones. She recognized beneath the ruin the bones of what her father had built, the careful geometry of the original beds still faintly traceable beneath the overgrowth. And she understood, standing there with her father's notebook held against her chest like a second heart, that she had been given, without anyone intending it as such, the chance to finish something he had been forced to leave undone. Mr. Naw, sake. Hargrove, the estate's steward, a cautious weathered man who had served at Marchmont for 30 years and had watched a great many fashionable London improvements proposed and abandoned by well-meaning strangers, met her at the gate with an expression of polite, thoroughly unconvinced scepticism. "His Grace tells me you have opinions about the garden, miss," he said, in a tone that suggested he expected those opinions to amount to very little. "I have more than opinions, Mr. Hargrove. I have my father's original plans." He looked at her properly then for the first time. "And who was your father, miss, if you don't mind my asking?" "Thomas Brennan," Alice said, watching his face carefully as she said it. "He built this garden 14 years ago, before your old duke dismissed him for a theft he did not commit. Mr." Hargrove was silent for a long moment, and something moved behind his careful, weathered expression that Alice could not quite name, though she filed it away, as she filed everything, in the private ledger she kept of small and significant reactions. "I remember him," he said finally quietly. "I remember a great deal about that business, miss, more than I have ever been asked to say aloud. But that is not my story to tell today. Show me these plans of yours, and we shall see what can be done." It was, Alice would think later, the beginning of an alliance neither of them announced, but both of them understood, and, over the following weeks, Hargrove tested her at every turn, the way a cautious man tests anything he has been burned by trusting too quickly before, questioning her choices, doubting her methods, watching closely to see whether her competence matched her confidence. By the second week of December, she had cleared the worst of the bramble from the western beds, working with 2 of the estate's under-gardeners, whom Mr. Stat Hargrove assigned to her with visible reluctance, and who returned within days, reporting to him with considerably less reluctance that the girl knew precisely what she was about. By the 3rd week she had begun the delicate work of repairing the orangery's broken panes herself, having learned enough of glazing from her father's notebooks to manage simple repairs, her hands raw with cold and cut glass, her composure never once slipping in front of the men who watched her, half expecting her to give up the work as too much for a lady's hands to bear. The Duke visited the garden more often than either propriety or genuine necessity required, always with some plausible reason, a question about drainage, a query about cost, and each visit chipped away, in small and increasingly visible increments, At the practiced blankness he had worn so long he had nearly forgotten it was armor rather than nature. Alice noticed this the way she noticed everything without remarking on it directly. The day he removed his gloves, without thinking, to help her lift a fallen trellis, the day he asked, almost involuntarily, whether her hands were too cold to continue, a question revealing an attentiveness he had clearly not intended to display. The day he stood in silence for nearly a full minute after she mentioned, in passing, that her father had designed the very beds she was now restoring. "Your father?" he said slowly on that occasion, something shifting behind his careful eyes. "Brennan, the garden architect my father dismissed." "Yes," Alice said, plainly continuing her work without looking up, because she had decided from the first day that she would not perform distress for his benefit any more than she had performed entertainment for it at dinner. "The same." He was quiet for a long moment. "Did not know." "I did not tell you," Alice said. "I wished to see whether the work would speak for itself before the name did." He did not answer immediately, and something in his silence told her, more clearly than words could have, that the crack begun at that first dinner had widened considerably further than either of them had yet acknowledged aloud. What neither the Duke nor Alice fully anticipated was the quiet arithmetic accumulating beyond the garden walls, the way good, patient work always eventually becomes noticed in a community that watches closely and forgets very little. Tenants on the Marchmont estate, whose small allotments had been neglected for years under an indifferent head gardener, began receiving, without much explanation beyond Mr. Tender, Hargrove's gruff instruction, cuttings and seed and advice on soil that Alice provided freely, in whatever hours she could spare beyond her formal work. A widow at the edge of the estate whose kitchen garden had failed 3 years running found it quietly restored to productivity by spring, because Alice, like her father before her, preferred the work itself to any credit attached to it. By January, word had spread quietly among the servants and tenants of Marchmont that the girl restoring the old walled garden was not merely skilled, but generous with that skill, asking nothing beyond the modest wage the Duke had arranged, and offering considerably more than that wage required. Accumulating unsolicited and entirely without her design, reached the Duke gradually through Mr. Dare's, Hargrove's increasingly warm reports, through his own observations on his rounds of the estate, through the unprompted gratitude of tenants who had never expected any improvement to their circumstances at all. It was in late January, searching through an old estate cabinet for unrelated correspondence regarding a boundary dispute, that the Duke came upon a locked drawer he had never had reason to open, containing his father's private papers from the year of the orangery's completion, and it was there, 'neath deeds and receipts long since irrelevant, that he found a letter that would finally break the last of his composure entirely. The letter was from Josiah Red, the former steward, addressed to a rival collector, dated the same month as the orchid's disappearance, offering for sale 3 rare specimens matching, in exact and damning detail, the very orchids Thomas Brennan had been accused of stealing. Red had never sent the letter, for reasons the Duke would never know, perhaps fear of discovery, perhaps a change of buyer, but he had kept it carelessly, among papers he must have assumed no one would ever trouble to examine, and it proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, precisely what Alice had already understood in her bones for 14 years. Her father had been innocent, ruined, not by his own dishonesty, but by a jealous man's greed and an old duke's refusal to examine evidence before destroying a reputation. He sat with that letter for a very long time. He understood, reading it, precisely what his family had done, dismissed an honest man on the word of a thief, closed the matter permanently, rather than risk the discomfort of investigating it properly, and left a 10-year-old girl to grow up in the shadow of a disgrace. He understood, too, why Alice had said nothing of her father's name until the work itself had spoken first, and he found himself sitting alone in his father's old study, with the letter trembling very slightly in his hand, feeling something he had not permitted himself to feel in 6 years of careful, deliberate numbness. He did not sleep that night. He rode to the garden at first light the following morning before Alice had arrived, and stood at its gate in the cold, thin dawn, watching a single robin work its patient way along the newly cleared border, pausing at intervals to watch him in turn with the small, unbothered attention of a creature entirely indifferent to titles. Standing there that he had spent 6 years learning to be exactly that kind of cold, and that he did not wish any longer to continue the lesson. Alice found him there when she arrived. An hour later, standing very still among the half-restored beds, the letter held loosely in one hand, and she understood, before he had said a single word, precisely what he had found. "You know," she said. "It was not a question. I found a letter," he said, "from Red. It proves your father never took those orchids at all." Alice set down her basket carefully, the way she set down everything, and looked at him for a long moment with the same plain, unhurried attention she gave to a damaged root, before deciding how best to save it. "I have known that for 14 years, she said. "I did not need a letter to tell me my own father's character, Your Grace. I only wondered how long it would take your family to require the proof for themselves. I am ashamed," he said, "that it took this long." "Yes," Alice said without cruelty, only the same plain honesty she had offered him across the dinner table 2 months before. "You should be. Though I did not restore this garden, expecting an apology, Your Grace, I restored it because it was my father's work, and I could not in conscience leave it half-finished, whatever your family had decided about the man who began it." A silence. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Now that I know that," Alice said, "is entirely your decision to make. I have never once needed your family's permission to know my father was an honest man. I do not require it now either." He did not answer immediately, because there was, for once, nothing correct to say, and he had spent 11 years never once being without something correct to say. "No," he said at last, "you do not. But I find I would still like to make what amends I can, if you will permit me to try." News of the letter's discovery, and of the truth it finally confirmed, could not remain entirely private, not in a household where servants and tenants had already spent 2 months quietly cataloguing Alice's patient competence, and when Mr. Hargrove learned of it, he did something he had not done in 30 years of careful, guarded service. He sought out the Duke directly and told him plainly exactly what he had known and never spoken of, that he had always suspected Red's hand in the matter and had held his tongue out of fear for his own position. A confession the Duke received with more grace than either of them expected, understanding by then that blame distributed too widely served no one, and that what mattered now was correction rather than punishment. The Duke did not offer Alice a swift proposal in the flush of discovered guilt, understanding, in the clearer light his shame had given him, that such a gesture would risk repeating his family's old error in reverse, deciding her future for her without sufficiently asking what she herself wished for it. Instead, he did something the county found rather more remarkable than a hasty engagement. He had his solicitors draw up, within the month, a formal document restoring Thomas Brennan's name and reputation on the public estate record, along with the full back payment owed him 14 years before. Paid now to his daughter, with interest, and with a written acknowledgment, entered permanently into the Marchmont estate papers, of the injustice done and the family's responsibility for it. He asked Alice, plainly, what she wanted beyond this, not what would be convenient, not what would settle the matter neatly, and listened, the same unhurried attention she had always given her work, to her answer. What she wanted, it turned out, was not a title, though she did not refuse the possibility of one when it was eventually and properly offered some months later. In a conversation conducted with far more plainness than romance usually allows, what she wanted was the garden itself, formally, under her own name and authority, established as a working commission she could point to as entirely her own, so that no one ever again could describe her as merely advising or assisting rather than designing and building, exactly as her father once had. Alice Brennan married Nathaniel Gray, Duke of Marchmont, the following autumn in a small ceremony held, at her particular request, in the walled garden itself. Fully restored by then, its beds thick with late roses her father's own notebooks had specified a lifetime before, the orangery glass gleaming clear and whole behind them for the first time in 14 years. On the morning of the wedding, standing at the garden gate before the guests arrived, Alice saw the same robin that had watched the Duke that cold January dawn, perched now on the newly mended trellis, entirely unbothered by the activity around it, watching her with the same small patient attention it had always given the place, as though it alone had witnessed every stage of the garden's slow return from ruin and found nothing in the outcome particularly surprising. Smoke rose, thin and steady, from the orangery's small stove behind her, warming the glass house through its first proper winter in over a decade, and she thought of her father's voice, plain and unhurried, even in memory, saying the words that had carried her the whole distance from that locked cabinet drawer to this morning: "The earth does not care who kneels in it, only that someone finally does." She had knelt in it long enough, and she turned from the gate at last, toward the life that was, finally and entirely her own, to tend.